In the last video, I introduced a game project that one of my students had made. He made this rocket space game where you dodge asteroids and you play as this rocket ship here. And we had coded up to this point where now we have the rocket moving and the asteroids are able to spawn, but we don't have any bullets, we don't have any stars yet, and we don't have any way of losing the game. Well, that's where I'm going to pick up this video. We're going to start with adding bullets to our player so our player can shoot. So I'm going to start by creating a bullet class, and I'll do this, say, above the player class. And so I'm going to create a bullet class bullet, so we can actually shoot bullets. The bullet class will also inherit from the sprite class. And now I'm going to create the constructor for the bullet, which will require an X and Y position in order to spawn. So here's my plan for bullets. I plan on just making bullets little thin rectangles, blue thin rectangles. So with that, we're not actually going to use a texture, but we are going to need a width and a height for the bullet. So I'm going to create constants for that. Bullet width will be, let's say 50 pixels, and bullet height will be 5 pixels. So now in the constructor, I'm going to call the sprites constructor, pass in X and Y, and then the bullet dimensions, bullet width, bullet height. Now the bullet's going to need a few more things. It will also need speed, so this dot speed, and I'm going to set the bullet speed to be double the asteroid, so I'll make it 8. Now the bullet will need a few more things. It's going to need a render function. Now you might be wondering, it's inheriting from the sprite, and the sprite already has a render function that we can see up here. So why are we going to write a new render function? Well, the way I've designed the bullets is the bullets are not going to have a texture. So in fact, that last sprite parameter of texture, we're just going to pass in null. There will be no texture. So since the bullet is going to need an X, Y, width, and height, we still inherit from sprite. But we're going to need to override its render function since we don't use a texture. And we're passing in null. We're just doing a rectangle. So let's create that function. The render function, all it's going to do is it's going to set the context's fill style to be the bullet's color. So let's create a color variable. This dot color equals, and let's make the bullet cyan. And now we need to set the drawing color. Context dot fill style equals, actually this dot color. Let's use our variable. And now we're going to draw the bullet just as a rectangle on the screen. Context dot fill rect x y, this dot x, this dot y, this dot width, and this dot height. And that will draw the context variable, or that will draw the rectangle on the screen. Now the bullet needs an update function. All the bullets will do is move to the right and delete once they reach the far side of the screen. So update, let's move the bullet to the right. So this dot x plus equals this dot speed. And now, for now, what we're going to do is I'm going to repeat what I did with the asteroids. Let's take a look at the asteroid update function. When it's time for an asteroid to be destroyed, it returns true for the update function. And if an asteroid lives longer, it's just going to return false for its update function. I'm going to do the same for bullet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the X position of the bullet is greater than the width of the screen. So canvas.width. Then we need to destroy this bullet because it's off to the right side. And we won't see it anymore. So return true. Otherwise, we're going to return false. And so now we're done with the bullet class. Now let's go ahead and create the bullet manager. And I'm going to zoom a little bit out. I'm going to create a bullet manager that's going to update and render all the bullets, as well as be responsible for spawning in new bullets. So class bullet manager. And then the constructor will be pretty basic. It's only going to have a list of all the bullets. So this dot bullets will be an empty list. We're going to have a number of bullets. So this dot bullet count, which will be 0. And now for the update function for the bullet manager, what we're going to do is use a for loop to iterate through every single bullet and call each individual bullet's update function. So for let I be 0, I is less than this dot bullet count, and I did a comma instead of less than. This I is less than this dot bullet count, I plus plus. I'm messing up so many of these keys right now. And what we're going to do, of course, we coded the functionality for the bullet to delete, where if it's time to delete, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. So let's check that. Let destroy be this dot bullets I dot update, and if that destroy variable is true, if that bullet needs to delete, so if destroy equals true, then we're going to delete the bullet and decrease the count. So I'm going to type this dot bullets dot splice I1. That's how we delete the current bullet. And now we need to update the counter. This dot bullet count minus minus. So that's it for the update. Now we need a function to render each bullet. So render, and it's going to use the exact same for loop. For I equals 0, I is less than the number of bullets on the screen, and then I plus plus, and we're just going to call each bullet's render function. This dot bullets I dot render. So now that's basically it for the bullet manager. Actually, one more thing. We need a function to spawn in a new bullet whenever the player presses the space key. And we'll worry about when this function is called later, but for now, let's create a spawn bullet function. Spawn bullet. It's going to take an X and a Y parameter because we need to know where this new bullet needs to spawn. And now what we're going to do is create a new bullet object. Let B for bullet be new bullet, and we're going to pass in the X and Y parameters. And then we need to add the bullet to the list. This dot bullets, this dot bullet count equals B, and then we need to update the count. This dot bullet count plus plus. And that is it for the bullet manager. We have all the functionality. Now let's make sure that the player is able to spawn in new bullets. So really, let's check on our keyboard dictionary, which I explained in the last video. It's a dictionary of the 3 keys we're going to use for this game, W, S, and space, and it just constantly is keeping track of whether the key is currently on or off, true or false. And I believe from last time we already created the event listeners. Yes, we did, where if the space key was pressed, we turn it true, and if it was released, we turn it false. So we already got the space key set up. Let's go ahead and make the player spawn a new bullet whenever he touches the space key. So when the players update, we have if the W key is pressed, we move up. If the S key is pressed, we move down. But if the space is pressed, if keys space is true, then we need to create a new bullet. So bullet manager, and actually I don't even have a bullet manager yet. I just created the class. So let's create one first. Bullet manager equals new bullet manager. All right, now that we have a bullet manager, we can say bullet manager dot spawn bullet, and let's for now just spawn the bullet at the exact same position of the player. So this dot X, this dot Y. And now what should happen is the player should be able to shoot bullets. And right now he's not. Oh, that's because we obviously need to render the bullets and update them. So in our main update function, we need to make sure we are calling bullet manager dot update, which will in turn update each individual bullet, and then bullet manager dot render. Now let's try that again. So I'm going to refresh the page. And we are able to shoot bullets like crazy. I'm able to hold down the space key and spam it, and this just looks really bad. So we need to add well, first of all, we need to change where the bullet is spawning relative to the player. And then we need to add a fire cooldown for the player so that I can't just hold down the key and create lasers like this. So in fact, let's start with the cooldown. So inside the player, I'm going to add a fire delay and a fire timer. So let's add the delay, this dot fire delay. And in fact, that can be a constant since it's never going to change. Const fire delay will be 30 frames. And then let's have a timer. This dot fire cooldown, which is going to be set by default to 0. So here's how this is going to work. We're going to have a fire cooldown, and it has to be equal to 0 in order for a bullet to shoot. Once we shoot the bullet, we're going to set that timer to the delay, which is 30. And now you're not going to be allowed to shoot again until this timer reaches back to 0. So in fact, what we need to do in the update function is just refresh the timer every time. So this dot fire cooldown minus minus. And let's just make sure this doesn't become a negative number. If this dot fire cooldown is less than 0, then we're just going to set it to 0. This dot fire cooldown equals 0. So that will update the timer. That will constantly decrease it, but hold it at 0 if it's at 0 currently. Now, we're not just going to spawn a bullet whenever the key space is pressed. We're going to spawn a bullet if the space key is pressed and the timer is 0. This dot fire cooldown equals 0. Actually equals 0. And then we also, once we spawn the bullet, I need to add curly brackets now that we're doing 2 statements for this if statement. There we go. So I added curly brackets here and here. So now what I need to do, in addition to spawning the bullet, we need to set the cooldown. So this dot fire cooldown is equal to, I blanked out for a second, fire delay. Now, if I did everything correctly, we should not be able to spam the bullets. And now we have that much better result where this is as fast as the player is able to shoot. Now, let's fix that weird positioning. The bullet spawns from here. And let me pull up the file and show you why. So here's the player's texture. So when it comes to HTML canvas graphics, the X and Y position of any sprite is not the middle right here. That is not the X and Y. The X and Y is actually the top left corner. So when I told the bullet to spawn at the same X and Y of the player, it spawned in the corner of the player. So what we need to do is lower the Y position by half the height of the player. Let's do that. So instead of spawning at exactly the player's Y, we're going to spawn at the player's Y plus half of the player's height. So now let's refresh that. And that looks much better. Now the bullet is spawning almost perfectly in the center, and that's good enough for me, except the bullet is still starting from back here. So what we're going to do is, now that we've moved the spawn location to here, we're going to add to the X position the entire width of the player. And that will move the spawn position here. And that will look much better. So I'm going to add to the X position of the spawn this dot width. Now let's refresh that. And now we get the bullet spawning in a much better spot. And it looks like there's a little bit of space in between, but that's really, I imagine, just because the bullet is shooting so fast. Yeah, there's no extra space in front of the player texture, so we're good there. All right, so now we have the bullet cooldown. Let's go ahead and add the functionality for the bullets to destroy the asteroids. So what we need to do is inside the bullet, inside the bullet update function, once we've updated the bullet, we need to also run a for loop. And what we're going to have each bullet do is each bullet is going to check if it's touching any one of the asteroids using a for loop. And then if it does touch one of the asteroids, it's going to return true. And that will signal to the bullet manager, it's time to delete. but we have no way of telling if two sprites in the game are touching. So what we need to do is go to our sprite class, and we're going to add a collision function. So this function is going to return true if the calling sprite is touching another sprite. So I'm going to type collision in the sprite. And so we're going to require 4 parameters, the x, y, width, and height of another sprite. So by the way this will work is we're going to type bullet.collision and then asteroid.x, asteroid.y, asteroid.width, asteroid.height. That's how this function is going to work. One sprite calls the function, and then you pass to the parameters all the dimensions of the other sprite. I'm not going to go in depth on the math of how you know if two boxes are touching, but it's something like this. First, you need the x distance between the two sprites. So the x distance is just the absolute value of this dot x minus x. And then you need the y distance. The y distance is the absolute value of this dot y minus y. And in order to know if the two sprites are touching, the x distance has to be less than a certain minimum x distance, and the y distance has to be less than the minimum. Well, the minimum x distance, min x distance, is actually their width. The width of one sprite divided by half plus the width of the other sprite divided by 2. That's the minimum x distance that our x distance can be for a collision to occur. And it's the same with the y. The minimum y distance is half the height of one sprite plus half the height of another sprite. So now, to see if the collision occurs, I'm just going to check if the x distance is less than or equal to the minimum x distance, and the y distance is less than or equal to the minimum y distance. And if that's true, we're going to return true for this function. And if not, we're going to return false. And so that should be our working collision function. Don't worry about all the math specifics. You can just memorize this right here, or maybe look up a video on box collision. 2D box collision, that is. Maybe I can make one in the future. All right, so now I'm going to go to the bullet class, and in the update function, we're going to create that for loop and check with each asteroid if we're touching. So for, let I be 0, I is less than asteroid manager, which we just called manager.asteroids.length. I++, so that will be for every asteroid in the list. Let's just create a variable for the current asteroid we're checking. Let asteroid, or A, be manager.asteroids I. So that's the current asteroid. Now let's check the collision. A.collision, and actually we need to check the result of this. Let collide be equal to a.collision, this.x, this.y, this.width, this.height. So this is just like the example I showed you earlier, except I kind of flipped it. I have the asteroid calling the collision function, and we're passing in the bullet dimensions instead. But it works either way. I could have done this.collision, a.x, a.y, a.width, a.height. Works either way. So now, if collide is true, then we need to return true. Return true. And that's it. Now well, actually we need to do two things, because that will destroy the bullet, but that won't actually destroy the asteroid. But let's make sure it does destroy the bullet. So now the bullet should destroy when it touches the asteroid, and it is. You'll notice that it doesn't look like it's exactly touching the asteroid, but that just has to do with the fact that the asteroid picture has a little bit too much space on the sides of it. So what I'm going to do is, before I upload this video, I'm actually going to modify these pictures so that there's no extra spaces on any of the sides and the collisions look a little bit more realistic. But that's why that's occurring. So the bullet is deleting, but we need to signal to the asteroid that it's time to delete. So let's create a variable for the asteroid. It will be called destroy. This.destroy equals false. And what we're going to do in the update function for the asteroid is, if at any moment this variable is true, then we just return true. So now the bullet, what the bullet will do is the bullet will set the asteroid's variable to true. So I'm going to re-add those curly brackets now that I have two statements to run. And I'm going to type a.destroy is now true. By the way, don't make the mistake of returning true in the function first and then setting the destroy variable. That won't work, because once you return from a function, the function's over. So this would never actually happen. So if you have that problem where the asteroids aren't deleting, maybe check that order there. All right, so now the asteroids should delete as well as the bullet, even though the collision looks a little choppy because of the size of the textures. And it is working. So now the next thing we're going to do is, let's have it to where the player also will die when he touches the asteroids. So in fact, I'm going to be a little lazy. The player's going to do the exact same thing as the bullets are doing. The player's just going to run a for loop for every asteroid in the game, and then the player will check if he's touching each asteroid and set its own destroy variable to be true if that happens. So really all this code is applicable. I'm just going to steal it. I'm going to copy it and hop over to the player update function. And at the end of all that stuff, I'm going to paste it. We're still going to iterate through the asteroids. We're still going to set A to be the nearest asteroid. And in fact, all this is true except this moment here. So if the collision was occurred, if a collision did occur, let's set the player's dead variable to true. This dot dead is false for now. And then if the collision function is true, then we set this dot dead equal to true. Okay. And now what we're also going to make sure we can't do is update the player if he's dead. So if this dot dead is true, or just if this dot dead, then return. So we're going to exit the player's update function early if he does die, because we don't want to still be able to move and fire if that happens. So now we have this for loop that will check if the player is touching any of the asteroids. Now let's also do one more thing. Let's make sure that the player can't draw on the screen once he's dead. So I'm going to add an if statement to the render function. If player.dead equals false, only then are we going to render the player. So now let's check that. I'm going to refresh the screen, and I'm going to crash into an asteroid, and hopefully the player will disappear. The player disappears, and I'm clicking space, and I am unable to shoot more bullets because we are no longer updating the player because of this code right here. So we're almost done with this tutorial. What I'm going to finish up with is we want to add a game over message at the very top of the screen, kind of like in the original game my student made. So we want that game over message to appear only once the player has died. Duh. Okay, that was probably the most duh statement I've made in this whole tutorial. But to do that, we're going to go to the HTML finally, and let's create a paragraph. The paragraph, the ID will be game over. I'm just going to call it game over. And there's going to be nothing in the inner HTML right now. It's just going to be an opening paragraph tag with an ID and a closing paragraph tag. What we're going to do is, as soon as the player dies, we're going to set the inner HTML to be the message game over. So now let's go over to the code and let's grab a variable that represents that paragraph. Var game over message is equal to document.getElement by ID game over. So now that we have the paragraph, what we can do is right here, right at the moment when the player dies, let me find that. Right here, when the player dies, what we're going to do is set the inner HTML, which is whatever comes in between the two tags. We're going to set that inner HTML to be the words game over. So game over message when the player dies dot inner HTML is equal to game over all caps to be extra rude about it. All right, let's test that out. Let's see if that does appear. And it's not going to look very good. The text is going to be like right here where my mouse is. Okay, player dies and we get game over. And this looks terrible for several reasons. One, this should be centered. It should be bigger. It should be bold text, red. And also, notice how the entire game screen moved down once that message appeared. That looks bad. So what we need to do is force this message to occupy a minimum height until the message appears so that the window doesn't move. So let's make a few changes, this time in the CSS. For the paragraph tag, or specifically the paragraph tag with the ID of game over. So I'm going to type hashtag game over. So for that specific paragraph tag, let's set the color to be red. Let's make it bold, so font weight bold. Let's make the font size, say 50 pixels. Font size 50 pixels. Let's make it center on the screen, so text align center. And let's also change the font. I do not like I don't know what the default Microsoft Edge font is, but just for all fonts in our game, let's set the font to something else. So I'm going to create a CSS rule for the body, and I'm going to set the font family to be Courier because I really like that font. So now let's also add code to make sure that the game over occupies a minimum height so that the whole window doesn't move down once it appears. So let's set height to be the same size as the font, I believe 50 pixels. So I'm going to refresh, and that seemed to take up extra space, but it is working. I'm going to run down, and the game over message appears. And that looked really good. Notice when I refresh the page, the space is completely empty. And so when I move the player down, it appears. It's very smooth, though maybe 50 pixels was a little bit much. Let's make it 40 pixels. Let's try that out. And then I'm going to crash one more time into this asteroid. So 40 pixels looks a little bit better. And now we have our game over message. I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to save one final part of the tutorial for my next video, just so that I don't cram too much content in this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and by now you have a working space game. Thank you for watching.